Hi, welcome to chapter 2 of John in the Bible as we're reading through to find out what the Lord has to say to us today. It starts off with Jesus going to a wedding where they turn water into wine. Not going to be doing that today. Let's get started. In chapter 1, we are introduced to Jesus through John the Baptist, and this is a different John that's actually writing about what's going on, and so we're in the middle of his story. He says, on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why would you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." So they did. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This is the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. They stayed there for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" His disciples remembered what is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." When the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you give to show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple. Are you going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in man. There are so many backstories to be told. I want to take some time. It's actually probably going to take a little longer to read the commentary. But if this is new to you, especially if this is new to you, you might be wondering about some of the customs. And so I want to go ahead and take some time, if you're willing, to continue on with me. Jesus was on a mission to save the world, the greatest mission in the history of mankind. Yet he took time to attend a wedding and take part in its festivities. We may be tempted to think we should not take out time from our important work for social occasions. But maybe these social occasions are part of our mission. Jesus valued these wedding festivities because they involved people, and Jesus came to be with people. Our mission can often be accomplished in joyous times of celebration with others. Bring balance to your life by bringing Jesus into times of pleasure as well as times of work. People look everywhere but to God for excitement and meaning. For some reason, they expect God to be dull and lifeless. Just as the wine Jesus made was the best, so life in Him is better than life on our own. Why wait until everything else runs out before trying God? Why save the best for last? When the disciples saw Jesus' miracle, they believed. The miracle showed His power over nature and revealed the way He would go about His ministry, helping others, speaking with authority, and being in personal touch with people. Weddings in Jesus' day were week-long festivals. Banquets would be prepared for many guests, and the week would be spent celebrating the new life of the married couple. Often the whole town was invited, and everyone would come. It was considered an insult to refuse an invitation to a wedding. To accommodate many people, careful planning was needed. To run out of wine was more than embarrassing. It broke the strong, unwritten laws of hospitality. Jesus was about to respond to a heartfelt need. Mary was probably not asking Jesus to do a miracle. She was simply hoping that her son would help solve this major problem and find some wine. Tradition says that Joseph, Mary's husband, was dead, so she probably was used to asking for her son's help in certain situations. Jesus' answer to Mary is difficult to understand, but maybe that's the point. Although Mary did not understand what Jesus was going to do, she trusted Him to do what was right. Those who believe in Jesus but run into situations they cannot understand must continue to trust that He will work in the best way. Mary submitted to Jesus' way of doing things. She recognized that Jesus was more than her human son. He was the Son of God. When we bring our problems to Christ, we may think we know how He should take care of them, but He may have a completely different plan. Like Mary, we need to submit and allow Him to deal with the problem as He sees best. The 6 stone water jars were normally used for ceremonial washing. When full, the pots would hold 20 to 30 gallons. According to the Jews' ceremonial law, people became symbolically unclean by touching objects of everyday life. Before eating, the Jews would pour water over their hands to clean themselves of any bad influences associated with what they had touched. Miracles are not merely superhuman events, but events that demonstrate God's power. Almost every miracle Jesus did was a renewal of fallen creation. Restoring sight, making the lame walk, even restoring life to the dead. Believe in Christ not because He is a Superman, but because He is the God who continues His creation, even in those of us who are poor, weak, crippled, orphaned, blind, deaf, or with some other desperate need for recreation. Capernaum became Jesus' home base during His ministry in Galilee. Located on a major trade route, it was an important city in the region, with a Roman garrison and a customs station. At Capernaum, Matthew was called to be a disciple. The city was also the home of several other disciples and a high-ranking government official. It had at least one major synagogue. Although Jesus made His city His base of operations in Galilee, He condemned it for the people's unbelief. The Passover celebration took place yearly at the temple in Jerusalem. Every Jewish male was expected to make the pilgrimage. This was a week-long festival. The Passover was one day, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted the rest of the week. The entire week commemorated the freeing of the Jews from the slavery in Egypt. Jerusalem was both the religious and political seat, and the place where the Messiah was expected to arrive. The temple was located there, and many Jewish families from all over the world would travel to Jerusalem during the key feasts. The temple was an imposing sight, a hill overlooking the city. Solomon had built the first temple on this same site almost 1,000 years earlier in 949 BC, but his temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. This temple was rebuilt in 515 BC, and Herod the Great had enlarged it and remodeled it. The temple area was crowded during Passover with thousands of out-of-town visitors. The religious leaders crowded it even further by allowing money changers and merchants to set up booths in the court of the Gentiles. They rationalized that this practice was convenient for the worshippers and as a way to make money for the temple upkeep. But the religious leaders did not seem to care that the court of the Gentiles was so full of merchants that foreigners found it difficult to worship. And worship was the main purpose for visiting the temple. No wonder Jesus was angry. The temple tax had to be paid in local currency, so foreigners had to have their money changed. But the money changers often would charge exorbitant exchange rates. The people also were required to make sacrifices for sins. Because of the long journey, many could not bring their own animals. Some who brought animals would have them rejected for imperfections. So animal merchants would do a flourishing business in the temple courtyard. The price of sacrificial animals was much higher in the temple area than elsewhere. Jesus was angry at the dishonest, greedy practices of the money changers and merchants, and he particularly disliked their presence on the temple grounds. They were making a mockery out of God's house of worship. John's records record the first clearing or cleansing of the temple. A second cleansing occurred at the end of Jesus' ministry, about 3 years later. God's temple was being misused by people who had turned it into a marketplace. They had forgotten or didn't care that God's house is a place of worship, not a place for making a profit. Our attitude towards church is wrong if we see it as a place for personal contacts or business advantage. Make sure you attend church to worship God. Jesus was obviously angry at the merchants who exploited those who had come to God's house to worship. There's a difference between uncontrollable rage and righteous indignation, yet both are called anger. We must be very careful how we use the powerful emotion of anger. It is right to be angry about injustice and sin. It is wrong to be angry over trivial personal offenses. Jesus made a whip and chased out the money changers. Does his example permit us to use violence against wrongdoers? Certain authority is granted to some, but not to all. For example, the authority to use weapons and restrain people is granted to police officers, but not to the general public. The authority to imprison people is granted to judges, but not to individual citizens. Jesus had God's authority, something we cannot have. While we want to live like Christ, we should never try to claim his authority where it has not been given us. Jesus took the evil acts in the temple as an insult against God, and thus he did not deal with them half-heartedly. He was consumed with righteous anger against such flagrant disrespect for God. The Jews understood Jesus to mean the temple out of which he had just driven the merchants and money changers. This was the temple Zerubbabel had built over 500 years earlier, but Herod the Great had begun remodeling it, making it much larger and far more beautiful. It had been 46 years since this remodeling had started in 20 BC, and it still wasn't completely finished. They understood Jesus' words to mean that this imposing building could be torn down and rebuilt in 3 days, and they were startled. Jesus was not talking about his temple made of stone, but his body. His listeners didn't realize it, but Jesus was greater than the temple. His words would take on meaning for the disciples after his resurrection. That Christ so perfectly fulfilled this prediction became the strongest proof for his claims to be God. The Son of God knows all about human nature. Jesus was well aware of the truth of Jeremiah, which states, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" Jesus was discerning, and he knew that the faith of some believers would be superficial. Some of the same people claiming to believe in Jesus at this time would later yell, "Crucify him!" It's easy to believe when it's exciting and everyone else believes the same way. But keep your faith firm, even when it isn't popular to follow Christ. Thank you for following Christ with me. Have a great day.
Oh, good. Good job. One bang for kids. Okay, we're done.